October 14, 1943. The dense forests of Belarus, 30 kilometers west of Gomel. The men of Kampfgruppe von Gottberg, a reinforced battle group of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, had been hunting Soviet partisans for 3 weeks. They'd grown accustomed to ambushes, to ghosting through villages that emptied before they arrived, to finding supply dumps abandoned just hours before their arrival. But this was different. Their lead reconnaissance element had captured a Soviet courier carrying detailed maps. Maps that showed the location of what appeared to be a massive partisan headquarters. Bunkers, ammunition depots, field hospitals, all concentrated in a wooded valley called Ushichi. According to the documents, over 2,000 partisans were gathered there, the largest concentration German intelligence had identified in the entire Belarusian region. It seemed too good to be true. And in the brutal mathematics of the Eastern Front, anything too good to be true usually was. Obersturmbannführer Karl von Gottberg commanded a force of approximately 1,500 men, 2 infantry companies, a pioneer company with flamethrowers, a battery of 105 mm howitzers, and 6 Sturmgeschütz 3 assault guns. His orders were simple: eliminate partisan resistance in the Gomel region and secure the vital rail lines connecting army group centers' supply depots. Von Gottberg was no stranger to anti-partisan operations. At 42 years old, the veteran officer had survived Stalingrad and earned his Knight's Cross during the 1942 summer offensive. He'd learned the hard way that partisans didn't concentrate their forces. They dispersed, melted into the civilian population, struck from nowhere and vanished like smoke. Which made these captured maps deeply suspicious. His intelligence officer, Hauptsturmführer Werner Dorfler, studied the documents with growing unease. The detail was extraordinary. Every bunker position marked. Supply routes clearly indicated. Even patrol schedules annotated in the margins. Dorfler had interrogated the courier personally, a 17-year-old boy who'd broken under questioning almost immediately, confirming that the headquarters existed, that it was occupied, that partisan commander Mikhail Prudnikov was there right now. "It's a trap, sir," Dorfler said flatly. "They want us to commit our entire force to a single location. While we're concentrated there, they'll hit our supply columns, maybe even our garrison at Gomel." Von Gottberg nodded slowly. Every instinct screamed the same warning. But he also understood the strategic reality. If such a partisan headquarters truly existed and he failed to act, the consequences would be catastrophic. The partisans had derailed 17 supply trains in the past month alone. Army Group Center was already operating on a razor's edge. He made his decision. They would attack, but cautiously, ready to withdraw at the first sign of an ambush. Little did he know, every assumption he'd made was wrong. The Kampfgruppe departed their forward base at 0400 hours on October 15. Von Gottberg divided his force into 3 columns, approaching the Ushichi Valley from different directions to avoid presenting a single concentrated target. The assault guns moved with the center column, their 75 mm cannons providing mobile fire support. The howitzers remained 5 kilometers back, registered on pre-plotted coordinates that would allow them to blanket the valley with high explosive shells if needed. The terrain grew worse as they advanced. The autumn rains had transformed the dirt roads into rivers of mud. The forests pressed close on both sides, ancient pines and birches that blocked out the pale morning sun, creating a twilight gloom that set every man's nerves on edge. This was perfect partisan country. Every tree could hide a sniper. Every shadow could conceal a Soviet anti-tank rifle team. By 0830 hours they'd covered 8 kilometers without contact. Nothing. No shots. No mines. No hastily abandoned campsites still warm with cooking fires. The silence was unnatural. Unterstarfer Hans Bleicher, commanding the lead reconnaissance squad, reported back via radio. No enemy activity. No tracks. No recent movement of any kind. Dorfler looked at von Gottberg. "They've evacuated. The maps were bait to draw us into the forest. The real attack is happening somewhere else." But von Gottberg's instincts were screaming something different now. Not that it was a trap, but that something was fundamentally wrong with their understanding of the situation. He ordered the advance to continue. At 0945 hours, the lead elements crested a ridge overlooking the Ushichi Valley. What they saw made no tactical sense whatsoever. The partisan headquarters was exactly where the maps indicated. They could see bunkers constructed from logs and earth, their firing slits clearly visible. Camouflage netting draped over what appeared to be supply dumps. Trenches connecting the positions in a deliberate defensive network. Smoke rose from several chimneys, meaning the position was occupied. But there were no sentries. No movement. No defensive preparations despite the fact that a German force of battalion strength was now in clear view on the ridge above them. Bleicher's voice crackled over the radio, thick with confusion. "Sir, I have visual on the objective. It matches the maps exactly. But there's no one moving. No guards. Nothing." Von Gottberg raised his binoculars. The magnification revealed more disturbing details. The bunkers were real, solidly constructed. But the camouflage netting hung strangely, almost decoratively. The trenches showed no signs of recent digging. The earth was settled, overgrown with grass in places. And those chimneys producing smoke, they were too regularly spaced, too deliberately obvious. "It's a mock-up," Dorfler breathed. "They've built an entire fake headquarters to draw us in. The trenches will be mined. The bunkers will be empty. When we commit to the assault, they'll hit us from the flanks." It was the only explanation that made sense. The Soviets had done this before, created elaborate deceptions to draw German forces into killing zones. Von Gottberg had seen it at Kursk, where dummy tank positions had drawn artillery fire for hours before the real armor appeared from an unexpected direction. He made the decision to probe cautiously rather than commit to a full assault. At 1015 hours, he ordered a single platoon forward, 35 men under Oberscharfer Friedrich Meister, a veteran of the Eastern Front since 1941. If it was indeed a trap, better to lose one platoon than the entire Kampfgruppe. Meister's men descended into the valley with weapons ready, every sense straining for the first crack of rifle fire, the first explosion of a mine. They reached the outer trench line. Still nothing. Meister reported back. "Trenches are real. Recently constructed. No booby traps detected so far." They advanced to the first bunker. Meister kicked open the door, expecting either emptiness or the blast of a demolition charge. What he found was worse than any ambush. The bunker was occupied. 43 people huddled in the darkness, staring at him with hollow, terrified eyes. Not soldiers. Not partisans. Civilians. Women. Children. Elderly men too old to fight. They wore the tattered remnants of peasant clothing, their faces gaunt from malnutrition, their hands clutched to their chests in unconscious gestures of protection. Meister's radio call was hesitant, disbelieving. "Sir, it's civilians. The bunker is full of civilians." Von Gottberg felt ice form in his stomach. "Say again?" "And children. No weapons. No military equipment." The second bunker revealed the same nightmare. 57 people, mostly women and children, some elderly. The third bunker, 32 more. The fourth, 28. As Meister's platoon moved through the position, the horrible truth became clear. This wasn't a partisan headquarters. It wasn't a trap. It was a refugee camp. The partisans hadn't abandoned this location. They'd never been here. The Soviet courier hadn't been captured. He'd been sent deliberately, carrying maps that were accurate in every detail except one crucial aspect: the identity of who occupied this position. Over 2,000 civilians had gathered here. Villagers who'd fled the German anti-partisan sweeps. Families whose homes had been burned in reprisal operations. Old men whose sons had been conscripted. Women whose husbands had disappeared. Children orphaned by 3 years of brutal warfare. They'd built these bunkers to survive the winter. The supply dumps were stockpiles of grain, preserved vegetables, firewood. The trenches were drainage ditches to keep their shelters from flooding. The smoke from the chimneys came from cooking fires, families preparing their meager rations. And the maps, the detailed, accurate maps showing every position, had been created by Soviet intelligence specifically to guide German forces to this location. Dorfler understood first. They want us to massacre civilians. They want us to murder 2,000 people and then they'll use it for propaganda. They'll photograph the bodies, show them to the Americans and British, prove that we're the monsters they claim we are. Von Gottberg stood frozen, his mind racing through the impossible calculus of the situation. His orders were to eliminate partisan resistance. These people were providing material support to partisans. That was undeniable. The food stockpiles here could feed guerrilla fighters for months. Many of these women had probably sewn uniforms, cooked meals, tended wounded partisans. The older boys might have served as couriers or scouts. Under the brutal logic of anti-partisan doctrine, they were legitimate targets. But they were unarmed. Huddled in bunkers. Terrified. Children clung to their mothers. An old woman clutched an Orthodox icon, her lips moving in silent prayer. Von Gottberg had witnessed horrors on the Eastern Front. He'd seen Stalingrad streets run red with blood. He'd walked through villages where partisan reprisals had left every building burning. He'd executed Soviet commissars according to the Commissar order. He'd done terrible things in service to a regime he'd long since stopped believing in. But this was different. This was a deliberate test of his humanity, designed by someone who understood exactly how German anti-partisan operations functioned. His men waited for orders. The assault guns idled on the ridge, their commanders watching through binoculars. The howitzer battery stood ready to fire on his command. 1,500 soldiers waited to execute his decision. The manual was clear: suspected partisan supporters were to be eliminated without exception. Entire villages had been erased under this doctrine. The precedent had been set 1,000 times across the occupied territories. But von Gottberg looked at a child, a girl perhaps 5 years old, clutching a crude wooden doll, and something in him refused. "Sir?" Dorfler's voice was tight with tension. "Orders." Von Gottberg keyed his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "All units, hold position. No one fires without my direct command." What happened next would determine not just the fate of 2,000 civilians, but the fate of every man in Kampfgruppe von Gottberg. Von Gottberg made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because it was wrong, but because it was right in a war that had long since stopped distinguishing between the two. "We're withdrawing," he said flatly. Dorfler stared at him. "Sir? These are not partisans. They're refugees. We have no tactical reason to be here. The intelligence was false, deliberately false. We're leaving." "Sir, with respect, our orders." "Our orders," von Gottberg interrupted, "are to eliminate partisan resistance. There is no resistance here. Only civilians trying to survive a winter that will kill them regardless of what we do." But he knew it wasn't that simple. Somewhere, Soviet intelligence officers were watching. Perhaps through spotters hidden in the forest, perhaps through agents embedded among the refugees themselves. They were waiting for the massacre. Waiting to document it. Waiting to use it to strengthen their alliance with the Americans and British, to prove that Germans were capable of any atrocity. If he simply withdrew, the partisans would claim victory. They'd say the Germans had been driven off by determined resistance. They'd use it to recruit more fighters, to inspire more resistance. Von Gottberg needed a different solution. At 1,245 hours, he assembled the civilian leaders: a former schoolteacher named Pyotr Volkov, a Orthodox priest named Father Anatoly, several village elders. Through his interpreter, he delivered an ultimatum that was part threat, part mercy, part calculated gamble. "You have 24 hours to evacuate this location. Take your food, your supplies, everything you can carry. Move east, away from the German security zone. If you are found west of the Saz River after tomorrow, you will be treated as partisan supporters. But if you go east, you will be left alone." Father Anatoly, a man of perhaps 60 with a long gray beard, stared at von Gottberg with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "You're letting us go?" "I'm giving you a chance to survive," von Gottberg corrected. "What you do with it is your decision." It was a calculated move. By forcing them to evacuate, he could claim operational success. The partisan headquarters had been eliminated, its occupants dispersed. The location would be destroyed, denying its use to anyone else. But he wouldn't have to murder 2,000 people who'd done nothing but try to survive. Yet there was another calculation, one he kept to himself. If Soviet intelligence had orchestrated this entire scenario to force a massacre, then denying them that massacre might be the most strategically valuable thing he could do. It would undermine their propaganda narrative. It would prove, at least to himself, perhaps to his men, that Germans were still capable of restraint. The civilians began evacuating immediately. Women bundled their children in every scrap of clothing they possessed. Men loaded sledges with sacks of grain, barrels of preserved vegetables, bundles of firewood. The elderly were helped along by younger refugees, entire families moving together through the forest paths leading east. Von Gottberg's men watched in silence. Some looked relieved. Others looked uncertain, troubled by the deviation from doctrine. A few looked angry, sensing that their commander had just made a decision that might cost them dearly. Dorfler approached privately. "Sir, when this gets reported to division headquarters, they'll want to know why we didn't complete the objective." "Then we tell them the truth," von Gottberg replied. "The intelligence was false. The position was not a partisan headquarters. It was a refugee camp. We dispersed the occupants and denied the location to the enemy. Mission accomplished. They'll ask for body counts. Then we'll provide none. Because there are none." By 1800 hours, the last of the refugees had departed. Von Gottberg ordered his pioneers to demolish the bunkers using explosive charges. The supply dumps were burned. The trenches were filled in. By nightfall, nothing remained but scorched earth and shattered timber. Kampfgruppe von Gottberg withdrew to their forward base at 2100 hours, having fired not a single shot. Von Gottberg submitted his after-action report on October 17, 1943. It was deliberately vague. Suspected partisan headquarters investigated and found to be abandoned. Position destroyed to deny future use to enemy forces. No German casualties. Enemy casualties, unknown. Division headquarters accepted the report without question. They had larger concerns. The Soviet autumn offensive was gathering momentum near Kiev, and anti-partisan operations in Belarus were a low priority compared to the collapsing front lines to the south. But the story didn't end there. Soviet intelligence had indeed orchestrated the entire scenario, though not quite as von Gottberg had imagined. They hadn't intended to document a massacre for propaganda. They'd intended to force one, to create an atrocity that would poison any possibility of local cooperation with German forces. The refugees at Ushichi had been deliberately concentrated there, the maps deliberately leaked, all to create an impossible situation that would result in mass civilian deaths. When those deaths didn't occur, when the refugees arrived in Soviet-controlled territory telling stories of a German officer who'd let them go, it created a different kind of problem for Soviet intelligence. It humanized the enemy. It suggested that not all Germans were mindless killers. It complicated the narrative. The refugees were quietly dispersed to different collective farms. Their story was suppressed. Father Anatoly, who tried to share what had happened, disappeared into the NKVD prison system. The official Soviet record makes no mention of Ushichi or von Gottberg's decision. German records are equally sparse. Von Gottberg never spoke of the incident publicly. He continued serving until May 1945, when he surrendered to American forces near Munich. During his denazification hearing, no mention was made of Ushichi. He was classified as a regular Wehrmacht officer, spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp, and was released in 1947. He died in 1978 in a small apartment in Hamburg. Among his effects, his daughter found a photograph, a crude wooden doll, the kind a child might make from scraps of wood and cloth. On the back, written in faded ink, Ushichi, October 1943. I could not save them all, but I could save these. The doll had been pressed into his hand by the 5-year-old girl as she evacuated with her mother. He'd carried it for 35 years, a reminder of the day he'd chosen humanity over orders. Of the 2,000 refugees who evacuated Ushichi, approximately 1,200 survived the war. Many died in the winter of 1943-44. Others perished in Soviet labor camps, deemed unreliable because they'd been captured by Germans and released, an impossibility in Soviet logic that marked them as potential collaborators. But 1,200 lived. 1,200 people who existed because one officer, in one moment, decided that following orders was less important than preserving his humanity. History never recorded von Gottberg's decision as heroic. He received no medals for Ushichi. No official recognition. In the calculus of total war, where millions died, 2,000 refugees saved barely registered as a footnote. But to those 1,200 survivors, to their children and grandchildren now scattered across Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, the name Karl von Gottberg carries a different weight. Not as a hero, he was still a Wehrmacht officer who served a criminal regime. But as proof that even in the darkest moments of history, individual choice still mattered. That even when officers thought it was a trap, even when the truth was worse, humanity could still prevail. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Vault as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.